This video was such a trip down memory lane. I dug up my old Pokemon cartridges because I wanted to take a look at what kind of Pokemon teams I entered the Hall of Fame with during my childhood. I will be talking about every mainline Pokemon game that I played up to Pokemon Black 2. I am only going up to Gen 5 because starting from Gen 6, I always planned out every team I used based on Pokédexes that leaked online before the game was released. The mainline Pokemon games that I played in my childhood are Red, Yellow, Crystal, Sapphire, Ruby, Emerald, Leaf Green, Colosseum, Diamond, Platinum, Soul Silver, White, and Black 2. I started my very first Pokemon adventure with Pokemon Red when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and at 14 years old, Pokemon Black 2 was the final game where I didn't really plan ahead a team of 6 Pokemon. So basically when I was a toddler up until the beginning of my teenage years. Not only will I be shortly reviewing every team I used, I will also share what kind of Pokemon I'd use nowadays as an adult, if I were to replay these games. Before I start, I would like to know what kind of teams you guys made in your childhoods. Let me know in the comment section. Even Hall of Fames with over-leveled starters are welcome. Now, let's see what I used in my first ever Pokemon game, Pokemon Red. Well, I guess the internal battery is dead. I encountered the same situation for Pokemon Yellow and Crystal, so I hope my memory of these games are accurate. I can already say for Pokemon Red and Yellow that I actually never finished these games as a kid. Cinnabar Island was always my endpoint before I started a new save file. As to why this is a story for another time. I've basically done multiple playthroughs of Pokemon Red without ever reaching the Elite Four when I was younger, but my team was always quite similar in the end. I always had one of my starters, but Charizard was my favorite one to use. Both Pidgeot and one of the Nidos were staples of my teams, especially Nidoking. Then I always added one of the evolutions to my team, with Vaporeon being the most common one. And of course, like most kids, I rounded out my team with the legendary Pokemon I had access to, Zapdos and Articuno. For a kid in the late 90s or early 2000s, this is a staple Pokemon Red team. It has a starter, regional bird, one of the Nidos, an evolution and at least one legendary bird. This team has an abundance of flying type Pokemon, but they are all dual typed, so there's still a decent amount of type variety. Pidgeot is really unnecessary here. If I knew how OP psychic types were back then, I would have used one. Now, if I were to make a new team for Pokemon Red, I would keep Charizard and Nidoking, because they're simply really cool Pokemon. Keep the evolution, but change it to my favorite one, Jolteon. Add Snorlax from the mandatory wild encounter, since it's an iconic and amazing Pokemon. Jinx, who I started to respect after using it once in a playthrough. If you get one from the trade in Cerulean City, it will level up very quickly. And then my final Pokemon is the gifted Hitmonlee. Not the strongest Pokemon, but it's ideal for all the normal types you need to face. This team can be assembled when I reach the halfway point of the game, with Snorlax being the final party member after completing the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town. I like having my team together as early as possible, so late game encounters usually don't make the cut. Next in line is Pokemon Yellow. My team always consisted of Pikachu, the 3 Kanto starters, and an evolution, with the 2 final members always being something random like Nidoking, a legendary bird, or a second Moonstone evolution. If I were to play this game nowadays, I would kick out the Pikachu as soon as possible for Jolteon, keep the 3 starters that you get as a gift, because using 3 starters without trading is a unique experience. Trade for the Machoke so I can play with a trait evolution, which is also very rare, and fill the final slot with Hypno, since the Jinx trait doesn't exist in this game. It would have been a pretty cool team to have if Jinx was still an in-game trait. My Hall of Fame would exclusively exist of Pokemon that I obtained from NPCs. Moving on to the only Generation 2 game in this video, Pokemon Crystal. Just like the Kanto region, I wasn't sure where to go after a certain point in the game. There are a few story beats where you need to backtrack, which is something I straight up didn't know was a thing. My 5-year-old self thought that previously visited areas weren't important anymore. I did revisit this game a few years later after I started to slowly understand the English language through playing other video games. I'm not entirely sure what age I was, but it's definitely before Pokemon Diamond was released in Europe and after I completed Pokemon Emerald. So I guess I was between 8 and 9 years old. I do have pretty vivid memories of the Pokemon I used in my playthroughs. I can mention many of them, but the ones that I remember completing the game with were Typhlosion and its iconic Flamethrower Thunder Punch combo, Suicune because I sure as hell was gonna use a legendary Pokemon, the shiny red Gyarados, a staple in every Johto playthrough, a Sandslash that I caught before Victory Road, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a major help against the Elite Four. The final two Pokemon are a bit hazy, but I probably also had a flying type, which was most likely Pidgeot. Then that leaves one Pokemon. Knowing myself, I'm pretty sure I caught a high-leveled wild Pokemon like Tentacruel near Whirlpool Islands or Graveler in Victory Road. I struggled a lot against the Elite Four with this team, but in the end, Typhlosion, Gyarados, Suicune and Pidgeot were enough to carry me to victory with the help of items. My Soul Silver team is miles better compared to this one. The move pools in Crystal are very shallow and the choice in TMs is just atrocious. It was difficult to put together a balanced team of Pokemon that I liked, but here they are. Typhlosion will be my starter with the Fire Thunder combo. The Gifted Sparrow is one of the best Pokemon in the game and I've grown very fond of it over the years, so I will use it whenever I can. The added EXP boost will make sure it never falls behind in levels. Heracross is a strong Pokemon that's available very early on and it can make easy work of Whitney. When you obtain Surf and Fly, you can go to Newbark Town and catch a Tentacruel at level 40, which should be at least 5 levels higher than the rest of your team at that point in the game, so it doesn't even need to catch up in levels. You can even give it Stab, Surf and Ice Beam immediately. I realized years later that you can get an Eevee to evolve into Espeon, very handy against the huge amount of poison types trainers use. And finally, I would like to use a Golem, but Game Freak hates us, so a Graveler will need to suffice. It's still a good Pokemon to use for Johto though. This team can be completed before you even fight Chuck, which is a little over the halfway point of the game. The third generation. This collection of games was the one where I spent most of my time on. I got my Game Boy Advance along with a French version of Pokemon Sapphire as my birthday present. There were no English versions available anymore, but my parents really wanted to give me a new Pokemon game at the time for my birthday. Speaking of birthdays, this means I got to play Pokemon Sapphire on the day that I turned 6 years old. I was excited the most to revisit my Hall of Fames from the Generation 3 games, though I quickly discovered that I had done a horrible deed during my teenage years. Apparently, I reset every save file from Pokemon Sapphire up to Pokemon Diamond without ever finishing any of the new playthroughs. I guess I did it because I transferred all of my Pokemon onto the newer games, but now it makes me kinda sad that such personal history is gone. At least the Generation 3 games are the ones that I remember the best. My Hall of Fame of Pokemon Sapphire existed of my starter Blaziken, who was also my first ever Pokemon to reach level 100. It was severely over-leveled, so it carried the rest of my team to the end of the game. Kyogre was definitely present. I used it alongside Blaziken in the end game. Swallow was my main flying type and Linen was my HM slave. The final 2 slots were flexible. I remember using Sableye, Roselia, Mightyena, Seviper, Camerupt and Lunatone. I just wish I could remember who made it to the Hall of Fame though. It seems that Sapphire was the first game where I didn't have a type overlap. A majority of Pokemon I used were underwhelming and outclassed, but that didn't stop 6-year-old me from defeating the champion, thanks to Blaziken. I won't be creating teams that I would use as an adult for Pokemon Sapphire and Ruby, since Pokemon Emerald is my preferred version to play out of these 3. I bought Pokemon Ruby while I was still playing through Pokemon Leaf Green, It was simply to make trading available to me and my brother, who was also getting into Pokemon. Despite having access to trading, I didn't use any trait evolutions for my Pokemon Ruby playthrough. Thinking back on my team, I'm honestly surprised at how balanced it was. Sapphire was the starter I picked for this game, and it made Leaf Blade one of my favorite moves at the time. Swallow was again present, and it won't be the last time you'll see it. I added a Gardevoir to the team after finally understanding how I could catch a Ralts. Zangoose was one of the coolest Pokemon ever to me as a kid, so it got a spot in the party. Swords Dance by Level Up in the early generations is amazing. I got myself an Aggron as a late game addition, and of course, a child's dream team isn't complete without a legendary Pokemon. Say hello to Groudon. I don't see any major flaws with this team. It's up there in my top 3. And then we get to Pokemon Emerald. I played this one together with my brother, but he didn't really have a sense for team building at his age, so it ended up like this. We chose Swampert as our starter, and it pretty much soloed a majority of the game until we got Rayquaza. Then it turned into a duo run. We also had a Line Nunu for HM support, and Swallow to fly around. Pelipper was also part of the team for water HMs. At one point I had a Dusclops that I used against Phoebe. I'll add it, but I'm not entirely sure it made the Hall of Fame. So yeah, this one was way worse than the Ruby team, but you honestly don't need more than Swampert, Rayquaza and a few HM slaves. I've played enough Pokemon Emerald in my life to know what I want for my definitive teams of 6 Pokemon. Swampert nowadays is my favorite Hoenn starter. You can't go wrong with this guy. Hariyama has caught my attention as I grew older and is now a staple of all my Hoenn teams. I can say the same for Manectric, especially with all the water types you encounter. My main flying type Pokemon won't be Swallow, but rather Crobat. It's rough to train in the beginning, but it pays off big time once you get past the Zubat phase. Linoone can't be missing as the HM slave. Pickup is also a fantastic ability to have during a playthrough. At this point, I have everything that I want on my team. The final slot will be a flexible one for a water HM slave in the late game or something like Gardevoir or Aggron. The first 4 members are some of my favorite Pokemon, and this team can be compiled before you face the 3rd gym leader, Watson. I just wish that Manectric and Gardevoir's move pools were a bit more varied. Gardevoir's best coverage move is Thunderbolt, but Manectric already needs DTM for it. I also thought Manectric was able to learn Flamethrower, but that apparently wasn't a thing in Gen 3. Pokemon Leaf Green is where I finally learned how to enter Saffron City. It only took me about 6 years, guys. Coincidentally, I almost did a monotype run in my first playthrough. My starter was again a Charizard, Pidgeot was my second flying type, Nidoking was my HM slave, and for some reason I ended up using the 3 legendary birds, even Moltres. Of course, this team served me very well because of the 3 legendary birds, but it's definitely overflowing with flying types. In terms of team synergy, I would rate this very low. My team nowadays would look very differently. My starter choice doesn't change and never will for Kanto. My first Pokemon to catch is Mankey, to deal with Brock. Primeape ends up being a pretty decent Pokemon. I really like to use Dugtrio in Kanto, especially because you can catch a high leveled one right before search. My favorite evolution, Jolteon, can't be missing on this team. Dodrio is the main flyer and can be obtained right before facing Erika, so it will be a great help alongside Charmeleon or Charizard. Nidoking will be a part of my team, but as a HM slave, so it will be replaced by the time I get my final team member, Starmie. 5 out of the 6 Pokemon can be obtained before facing Erika. Technically, I can also obtain a Staryu before the 4th gym, but I would need to obtain the Pokeflute before that. I learned about the existence of Pokemon Colosseum from a friend that had a GameCube. He didn't really like it, but I was so obsessed with it that I convinced my parents to buy me a GameCube just to play this game. I remember looking at the GameCube games in the store and Pokemon XD was already on the shelf. though for some reason I didn't realize it was a sequel to Colosseum and I never bought it, which I've regretted ever since. My friend sold Colosseum to me for a decent price and I quickly learned that it wasn't much of a cakewalk like the mainline games after facing the first Sapphire admin. I played XD in my early 20s, but that game and everything after Gen 5 will be for another video, so definitely subscribe to the channel to stay up to date. Let's move on to the team I used. I kept the Umbreon and Espeon you get at the start of the game, super useful Pokemon for Colosseum. The first Shadow Pokemon I used was one of the Johto starters, but I didn't know what I was doing and accidentally chose the best one, Croconaw. For some reason I decided to keep Plusle on my team, probably because it's the only non-Shadow Pokemon you get before getting access to Purifying. I was still enthralled by legendary Pokemon when I played Colosseum, so Entei and Suicune made the cut. I decided not to use Raikou because Plusle was already a higher level and Purifying was a pain in the ass if you didn't know the fastest way to do it. There were many Pokemon that felt underwhelming to me. I just ended up using what I was familiar with: Evolutions, a starter and legendaries. For a new playthrough, I would keep Umbreon, Espeon, Feraligatr and Entei. Then replace Plusle with the Shadow Fluffy that you can catch early on, and instead of Suicune, I would like to use Hariyama, simply because it's very useful and one of my favorite Pokemon. Normally I don't use legendaries like Entei in my playthrough, but I think it's fair for Pokemon Colosseum. It's not like I have great fire type alternatives besides Typhlosion anyway. Starting with the Generation 4 games, Pokemon Diamond got gifted to me by my parents at the age of 9. It was my favorite game as a kid, but nowadays I would never play it over Pokemon Platinum. Let's get into the team I used. Torterra was my first ever Sinnoh starter that I chose. Staraptor was my main flying guy. I used Luxray because I thought it was the coolest Pokemon ever, but it ended up being kinda weak. Floatzel showed me that priority moves can be useful because of Aqua Jet. Skuntank was the third shiny that I had ever obtained, but the first one that made it to a Hall of Fame. And of course, Dialga was also there. I can't ignore the fact that I have the iconic trio of Staraptor, Luxray and Floatzel, but even though it was a shiny, I have to give my younger self props for using Skuntank. I used Pokemon that I really liked a lot at the time, and just like many other kids, it ended up being a few of the popular ones. On to the next game in line. Pokemon Platinum is one of the few mainline games that I've never bought. That is because my dad got me one of those flashcards, indirectly introducing me to the world of pirating and ROMs at the age of 11. The flashcard itself doesn't work anymore, but I still have the micro SD card, so I can proudly announce that the very first Hall of Fame was recovered for this video. It only took me 9 games, guys. You basically put ROMs on a flashcard, so I just moved the files to my PC and opened them in an emulator. Here's my Hall of Fame from Pokemon Platinum. I chose Empoleon as my starter for this game, and my brother traded me a Grottle between the 3rd and 4th gym, so I had 2 starters on my team. The 3rd member ended up being Lucario, pretty good for special coverage. I made use of trading again and got myself a Scizor, but it wasn't a Technician one. For some reason I took a Snorunt with me to the Hall of Fame, probably for using revives on my KO'd Pokemon. I was still into legendaries, so Giratina also made it onto the team. This team has 3 steel types and 4 weaknesses to fire? Yikes. It's kind of a step down from my Pokemon Diamond team, despite having 5 individually strong Pokemon. The party I would use nowadays is a bit more reminiscent of my Pokemon Diamond team. Infernape has turned into one of my favorite starters of all time. I used it a lot in competitive matches in later generations. Torterra still has a soft spot in my heart, but I prefer to use something with a bit more speed in my playthroughs. Staraptor is again my main flying type, and Floatzel is also back on duty. Rodom is a pretty unique Pokemon and it's easy to obtain. It's just too bad that I can't change its form without using cheats. Sneasel is obtainable quite late into the game, but Weavile is in my top 3 favorite Pokemon, so I would do everything to make it work in Platinum. My barrel will tag along for HM purposes. Amazingly, I can get 5 of the Pokemon before facing the third gym. I don't mind Sneasel's late availability too much, since it can be very powerful against 2 Elite Four members and 3 of Cynthia's Pokemon. It's just too bad that many cross-gen evolutions are locked behind trading, since I would have loved to use an Electivire. Pokemon Soul Silver shares a similar story with Pokemon Platinum. I never bought it because my parents pirated it for me, which we all have regretted ever since. I played it alongside Pokemon Platinum since I had both games on my flashcard from the start. My starter in this game was Feraligatr, because I already chose Typhlosion for Pokemon Crystal. Lantern was the second water type on my team. I primarily used it for special water and electric attacks, so it was different enough from Feraligatr. Then I made use of trading and got myself a Machamp and Golem. Huge improvements from using their previous evolutions in earlier playthroughs. I added a Dratini from the game corner to my team, hoping to get a Dragonite by the time I reached the Elite Four. Imagine my disappointment when I got to the end of Victory Road and Dragonair still had 15 levels to go before evolving. Lugia filled the legendary slot of my team. This thing couldn't die. The core of Feraligatr, Machamp and Golem were strong enough to get me through many fights. Lantern and Lugia were mostly there to soak up attacks and hit back super effectively. I was happy with this team, especially after finally getting my own trait evolutions. It's just sad that Dragonair levels up so slowly, making it impossible to get a Dragonite at the end of the game. The team I would use now is mostly the same from Pokemon Crystal. Typhlosion, Pharaoh, Espeon, Heracross and Tentacruel can all stay. I'm just filling the final party slot with Ampharos instead of a legendary. Making Mareep unavailable in Pokemon Crystal was a mistake. I would really love to use a Houndoom in my playthrough, but Houndour is locked away in Kanto, and there are a lot of Gen 2 Pokemon that are outclassed by Gen 1 Pokemon. If the Gen 2 Pokemon were handled better in Johto, my team would look quite different. The final generation of this video consists of 2 games, with the first one being Pokemon White. I got this one when I was 13 years old, but I almost didn't buy it. My friends considered Pokemon to be too childish and Call of Duty was the only game you were suddenly allowed to play. As you can see though, I'm still playing Pokemon many years later. Samurott will be my starter for the Gen 5 games. I originally had a Unpheasant, but I found the design so ugly that I replaced it with an Emolga later on, who in turn got axed in the final fight for Zekrom. I managed to get myself a Gigalith by trading with my brother. I usually don't use very slow Pokemon in a playthrough, but I was impressed by the physical bulk and power. I had 2 ground types on my team, Excadrill and Crocodile. They are in my top 3 favorite Gen 5 Pokemon, and the final team slot was taken by a Pokemon that you can't obtain anymore, Victini. This team had a lot of power behind it, especially with 2 Earthquake users. Defensively, this team is not too great because it's too weak against water types. Excadrill, Crocodile and Gigalith would never appear together on my team nowadays though, unless it's a sand team. I always try to make a balanced team of Pokemon that I like a lot. Despite trying to find a good balance for the team I would use nowadays, I couldn't really fix the defensive issue against water types. These are the Pokemon I would use now. Samurott is my starter. I couldn't take 2 ground types with me again, so I had to choose between Excadrill and Crocodile. I decided to take Excadrill with me in this game because I already have 2 steel types in the sequel. Crocodile will see some play in Black 2. I really love Darmanitan with its powered up Flare Blitz. Such a nuke can't be missing on my team. I will never ever take the Zen mode variant though, that ability is a hindrance. I am not sure if I will use Unpheasant to have a temporary flying type, but Archeops will be my definitive flying type. If you know how to play with this guy, it's super strong. I have never used Galvantula in any kind of playthrough, but I've used it a few times in competitive, and spamming 91 accurate thunders is brainless fun. My favorite fighting type in this generation is Mienshao, but Mienfoo becomes catchable quite late into the game. I'm not sure if it's worth the wait, since Sauk is a powerful fighting type that's available before the second gym, which is normal type. There's also Scrafty, whose evolution requirement is a bit too high for a 2-stage Pokemon in my opinion, and Conkeldurr is, well, a trait evolution. Mienshao versus Salk is something I need to test out in a playthrough, so I'll put them both in the final slot for now. Pokemon Black 2 was the first Pokemon game where I started to experiment with PvP, and through doing research, it's how I discovered Pokemon Showdown. I only knew about 3 Pokemon that I wanted beforehand. These were Samurott, Jolteon and Lucario. These 3 made it to the Hall of Fame, and the other half of my team consisted of Magnezone, Arcanine and a random underleveled Pelipper. Magnezone and Arcanine were available very early on, like my other team members. I thought this combination of Pokemon was already very good, even though there's an electric and steel type overlap. If I were to do another playthrough, I would keep Samurott, Magnezone, Lucario and Arcanine. I'd get rid of the electric type overlap by replacing Jolteon with Crocodile. I told you he'd come back, and Crobat also makes another appearance on one of my teams. It's one of my favorite flying types. This team is up there with my Pokemon Platinum and Emerald team for being one of the earliest completable teams. Well, I went over every Hall of Fame team I've had during my childhood. It was kinda sad to discover that my games of the first 2 generations had no save files on them anymore. And on top of that, I've been dumb enough to reset my save file of Pokemon Diamond and all of my Generation 3 games. There's nothing I can do about it. I have a video planned that's similar to this one, but for the mainline games I played at 15 years old and beyond. Luckily, I still have my Hall of Fames of all games I've played beyond Gen 5. So I'm really excited to collect footage for that video. It's time for me to go. Don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to my channel. Have a good one.